Now, the ever-growing number of regional trade agreements and preferential trade arrangements is a prominent feature of global economies. However, the role of regional bodies in Africa remains an ongoing conversation for Africa's regional economic integration story. Joining us now via Skype is Sia Bineza, who is the director at Rethink Africa. Sia, good to have you with us today, and very timely for this discussion to take place because we know the AU summit is currently underway in Kigali, Rwanda. But I'd like to get your views firstly on the relevance of regional structures such as SADC, COMESA, ECOWAS, as well as the East African Community of Countries. What's your take?
Well, look, these structures have varying relevance. From my opinion and my perspective, the AU is more of a political structure. However, as we come into the smaller groupings such as SADC and ECOWAS and the EAC and even SACU closer to home, they become very important as, a driver of additional growth, especially in the current slow global growth environment that we're in. More and more, increasingly, we're becoming more conscious that we need to look into the closer region, especially South Africa, given that we also suffer from domestic slow demand. So we need increasingly to tap into the regional markets so that we can make up for this deficit in demand.
You mentioned something so critical there, which is economic growth as well as increased trade relationships, free flow of individuals. And these are all terms that we hear of so often. But if you just take a look at what's happening between Zimbabwe and South Africa, again, it shows that perhaps we are buying into pie in the sky policies here. Your thoughts with regard to how we can actually make these tangible experiences?
Well, the challenge is, as we have seen also in the European Union, that once the region has a lot of inequality amongst the countries, and the disparity in Southern Africa is very big. South Africa really is the sort of magnet economy in Southern Africa and accounts for a greater proportion of the GDP in the region. So this starts creating difficult dynamics, because when we're talking regional integration, we're really talking the nexus of politics and economics at its core. And I think the retaliation we're seeing from Zimbabwe and probably some SACU member states as well is partly a consequence of this inequality, because South Africa is seen as a so-called big brother or the biggest beneficiary of the regional community. There are ways in which these countries are trying to develop their own industry so that they can compete against South African industry, because as things are, the trade flows are really unequal. The region imports a lot from South Africa and we export the most, and there are really very little reciprocal trade mechanisms in place in the region. And that's really what sets up, and upsets the balance. If you look at regions such as the East African community, where there is a bit more convergence, things are flourishing. The region's growth is, very, very stable, and it's, close to double digit for some member states. And so you realize that the dynamics become more difficult as you have more inequality, as we've seen in many of these regional communities, not just within the continent itself.
So often we hear that political will is at the center of ensuring that this integration does take place. How do we balance country sovereignty together with regional leadership taking place here?
Well, that's always the central issue from wherever you look at it, because at some point, for you to benefit within these regional economic communities, you need to let go of some sovereignty so that you can start creating regional policies and really enabling what is termed, the macroeconomic or economic convergence within the region. And in the case of individual member states, this is really a decision you make considering a matrix of what are the benefits you gain from this economic community. And we've seen that, especially in Southern African region, many countries are members to different communities, which some have called, the spaghetti of regional integration. But it's all about balancing benefits versus losses elsewhere. So if countries see it, plausible that they'll sacrifice part of their policy space in return for either trade or whatever other benefits they get from the regional economic community, members or countries do that. And it's just really about trade-offs. And as we've seen in the region, the countries tend to trade off even regional economic communities against one another.
So very briefly, I'm going to steal 30 seconds here, but your take on some of the issues that need to be key and critical at the AU summit, especially on the back of the news that there's potential for an African passport to be launched. Threats and opportunities, I take it, posed both ways here.
Sure. I think one of the first things is that, yes, an endeavor such as the African passport is, a great endeavor. We really certainly need to do more about, freedom of movement of people. However, this also comes with a lot of security threats and a lot of paranoia, especially to what I term, the magnet economies of all of these regions, whether it's, Nigeria or Ghana in West Africa or Kenya in East Africa or South Africa in Southern Africa. This does pose a security threat for countries like that, which present, this sort of unequal or greater economic opportunities. Secondly, I think the biggest important consideration needs to be made is how do we develop regional value chains? Regions such as the Asian and Southeast Asian nations as ASEAN have managed to perfect this in balancing foreign direct investment with the regional networks of production. And I think South Africa, or Africa as a continent, is lagging behind in this area, Southern Africa more specifically. And I think lastly, it would be important for members or leaders to discuss how do we leverage a lot of the regional infrastructure projects such that they can create this sort of infrastructure connection such that the economic connections can then be made, because ultimately we do need infrastructure to connect.
Yeah. See, unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for providing insight. We've run out of time, but that was Sia Bineza, who's a director at Rethink Africa.